Welcome to Le Weekend, your essential roundup of French news on culture, business, the economy, and current affairs. We bring you a convenient way to catch up on the stories from the past week in France, plus an additional focus feature blending reportage and cultural context.
These are the news on Monday, February 16th. French utility EDF faces higher costs from electricity oversupply. French nuclear operator EDF said on Monday it faces increased maintenance costs of around 1.5 to 3.75 million euros a year, as it has to reduce power at its nuclear reactors to respond to increased electricity supply and slow demand, as reported by Reuters. Record flooding across France hit as storms fall on saturated ground. Storms have left large parts of France underwater, with record levels of flooding after heavy rain fell on already saturated soil. In Paris, the Seine is 4 meters above its normal level, forcing the closure of the Riverside motorway and some commuter rail stations, as reported by RFI. The government of Prime Minister Le Cornu is urgently finalizing its proposal on artificial intelligence in the Senate. During the Senate's examination of the Adaptation to European Union Law bill, Sébastien Lecornu's government clarified the governance of artificial intelligence by submitting a long series of amendments, with debates starting this week, according to sources cited by La Lettre. These are the headlines on Tuesday, February 17th. French authorities have let the seized oil tanker Grinch leave territorial waters after the company owning the vessel had to pay a penalty worth several million euros, according to the French foreign minister, as reported by Reuters. President Macron kicked off a 3-day visit to India with a 30 billion euro fight jet deal on the table. The French president's fourth visit to India since taking office in 2017 focuses on defense, technology, and trade cooperation, as reported by Le Monde. 9 suspects have been arrested in the investigation into the killing of right-wing activist Quentin Deronck, a case that has intensified tensions between France's far-right and hard-left ahead of municipal elections in March and the presidential election in 2027, as reported by RFI. These are the headlines on Wednesday, February 18th. Consumer prices in France rose 0.4% year-on-year in January, according to Statistics Office ANSEE, and matching the preliminary reading published earlier this month in a poll of analysts reported by Reuters. Paris prosecutors opened 2 new Epstein probes and call on victims to come forward. One investigation will focus on sex abuse crimes and the other on financial wrongdoing, following the release of millions of files by the U.S. Justice Department, as reported by Le Monde. These are the headlines on Thursday, February 19th. France's audit office said tax hikes are tapped out and spending cuts are inevitable. France can no longer rely on tax hikes to rein in its public finances and must shift decisively towards spending cuts as it faces a second consecutive year of strained public accounts, according to the National Audit Office, as reported by Reuters. A hacker accessed data from 1.2 million bank accounts. The French Economy Ministry said the hacker used stolen credentials from an official. Owners of the affected bank accounts will receive notifications in the coming days, as reported by Le Monde. Despite continuous sparring between President Donald Trump's administration and the French government, Americans flocked to France in 2025, with U.S. visits rising 17% compared to the previous year, according to figures from the French Tourism Ministry, as reported by Reuters. France said it was surprised by the presence of the European Commission at the Board of Peace in Washington. A spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry said the representative did not have the mandate to represent member states, as reported by Reuters. France will arm railway and metro police with stun guns. Transport Minister Philippe Tabarot said several hundred officers policing trains and the Paris metro would be equipped with electroshock weapons on an experimental basis, as reported by Le Monde. France's image has deteriorated in the eyes of American investors. An annual barometer conducted for the past 26 years on behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce in France showed a steady decline in confidence among U.S. companies based in France. Political instability, budgetary delays, economic stagnation, and excessive regulations and standards were all subjects that generated frustration, as reported by Le Monde. These are the headlines on Friday, February 20th. French restaurants are struggling to hire staff, and employees often only stay for a few months. According to unions, the sector's declining appeal is largely due to low wages and difficult working conditions, as reported by RFI. Social media platforms YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram are under pressure from the French Competition Authority to be more transparent with content creators. In a groundbreaking opinion, the Competition Authority recommends that YouTube, as well as Instagram, TikTok, and all major platforms, be more transparent in order to rebalance their relationships with content creators, particularly regarding content promotion and the sharing of advertising revenue, as reported by Les Echos. France welcomed record visitor numbers to remain the world's top destination. Atout France, the National Tourism Development Agency, said the country drew a record 102 million visitors in 2025, keeping its place as the world's top tourist destination. The figure was 2 million higher than in 2024, as reported by RFI. The Paris Farming Show opened without cows for the first time due to disease concerns. French President Emmanuel Macron opened the annual Paris International Agricultural Show on Saturday, but for the first time ever, it is without cattle following an outbreak of lumpy skin disease. Two of France's farming unions are also boycotting the usual meeting with the president, as reported by RFI. France returned a talking drum to the Ivory Coast on Friday, a sacred object that had been looted in 1916 during the French colonial period. This restitution is part of a process initiated by France in 2017, which had already resulted in the return of other objects to Senegal and Benin, as reported by France 24. You are listening to Le Weekend. And now that you're all caught up with the news from the past week, it's time for our focus story. Today we look at why the farm show made the news this week and why it is such an emblematic event in Paris and for all the rest of France. On the morning of Saturday, February 21st, French President Emmanuel Macron walked through the gates of the Paris Expo at Porte de Versailles to open the 62nd edition of Salon International de l'Agriculture, the annual agricultural fair that draws farmers, politicians, and city dwellers together for 9 days every year in the French capital. The doors open to the usual smells of straw, the sounds of bleating sheep, the laughter of children, music, but there was something important missing, something that for the first time in the show's modern history, going back to 1964, was simply not there. The cows were gone. For 62 years, cattle had been the undisputed stars of the salon. Price Limousin, Norman dairy breeds, Aubrac beasts with the wide eyes, they all filed through Hall 1 every year, groomed to perfection, drawing crowds of Parisians who had perhaps never been that close to a farm animal. This year, for the first time since the show was established in its current form, not a single cow would compete in the Concours Général Agricole, the competition that has been one of the fair's central attractions. The reason? Lumpy skin disease. The story of how France ended up with a cow-free agricultural show begins in late June 2025. In a village in the French Alps, France confirmed its first ever outbreak of lumpy skin disease on a cattle farm in Chambry in the Savoie department, a viral illness that had spent decades creeping westward across the globe. Lumpy skin disease, or LSD, is caused by a virus that spreads primarily through biting insects, flies, mosquitoes, horseflies, that act as mechanical vectors carrying the virus from one animal to the next. The disease itself is not transmitted to humans, but its consequences for cattle are significant. Fever, painful skin nodules, reduced milk production, weight loss, and sometimes even death. There is no cure. Morbidity rates typically range from 10 to 20%, with mortality generally between 1 and 5%, though it can reach 40% in young animals. The disease was first observed in Zambia in 1929 and remained largely confined to Africa and the Middle East for decades. Then slowly it moved. By 2015, it had reached southeastern Europe, triggering outbreaks in Greece, Bulgaria, and the Balkans, before being brought under control through mass vaccination. In 2025, it arrived in Western Europe for the first time in the modern era, with Italy, Sardinia confirming an outbreak in June, followed by Lombardy 4 years later, and then France. The outbreak spread quickly through the Alpine departments, and by early August, 64 outbreaks had been identified across 35 farms, and a new outbreak in September was confirmed in the Rhône department, the first in that region, bringing France's total to 79 confirmed cases. Eventually, France recorded 114 outbreaks in total since June, with thousands of animals culled in response. The government acted swiftly. France launched emergency vaccination targeting around 350,000 domestic bovines across restricted zones in Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, using vaccines supplied from the EU's lumpy skin disease vaccine bank. The campaign was later extended to Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, Occitanie, and preventively to Corsica. The country had lost its LSD-free status, with real-world consequences including suspended imports of live animals and certain dairy products by other nations, including the United Kingdom. It was in this context that France's bovine selection organizations made their decision. Major breeding groups, including Prim-Holstein France and France Limousin Selection, collectively chose to withdraw their animals from the Concours Général Agricole, both out of caution and in solidarity with regions hardest hit by the disease. The show's organizers accepted the withdrawal with what the official statement described as a full understanding. For more than 60 years, the Paris Agricultural Show had implemented strict organizational and sanitary measures to welcome cattle, the statement noted, but the breeder's decision was respected without question. The mascot planned for 2026, Begin, a Brahman cow from Martinique, chosen to celebrate France's overseas territories, would not make her journey to Paris. Her appearance was described as postponed but not cancelled. To understand the impact of this decision, it's necessary to understand what the Salon de l'Agriculture actually is and what it means. The event in its current form dates back to 1964, and immediately on the very first edition drew more than 300,000 visitors, but the roots go considerably deeper. The competition at the heart of the show was first held in 1870. After moving through various Paris venues, it settled at the Parc des Expositions at Porte de Versailles in 1925, where it has remained ever since. The 1964 edition was not a beginning so much as a rebranding and expansion, the moment when a livestock competition became something much larger, a national showcase for everything French agriculture produced, from prize-winning Charolais bulls to regional cheeses, artisan honeys and wines. The show is the world's largest agricultural event open to the general public, covering roughly 16 hectares of exhibition space and 9 pavilions, drawing close to 600,000 visitors annually, equivalent to roughly 1% of the French population, an extraordinary figure for a single event. For this year's edition, despite the absence of cattle from competition, organizers confirmed approximately 3,500 animals and more than 1,000 breeders from across France's regions, with 30 countries represented and Côte d'Ivoire as the guest of honor. But why does a farming show occupy such a central space in the national calendar? The answer lies in what agriculture means to French identity, not just economically, but culturally. As Paul Smith, Associate Professor in French Politics and History at the University of Nottingham, has observed, agriculture occupies enormous psychological space in how the French perceive themselves. A significant share of the French urban population is only a generation or two removed from the countryside. Without agriculture, there is no gastronomy, and gastronomy is a cornerstone of national identity. The Salon sits at the intersection of all of that. So, in February, during the school holiday period, the exhibition center in Paris is transformed into what commentators say is the biggest farm in France. Urban families, children line up to get close to the animals, watch demonstrations, and sample cheeses made in mountain villages they may have never visited. The event is simultaneously agricultural trade fair, food festival, and a cultural ritual. It also serves as a political arena, with presidents and presidential candidates spending hours at the show, sampling regional delicacies, patting livestock, gripping hands in every aisle, and setting a template that every subsequent president or major candidate has been obliged to follow. This year's absence is felt. The 500 to 600 cattle that typically fill the halls each year, producing roughly 40,000 liters of milk over the 9-day event, according to prior coverage, are not there. The mascot cow, who would normally become a temporary national celebrity, featured across media and adored by thousands of school children, stayed home. The disease crisis is not over. Vaccination campaigns continue. The virus remains in France's restricted zones. In the meantime, the Salon de l'Agriculture opens its doors as it has done every year since 1964, except for one time during the pandemic, a ritual that has survived political upheaval, economic crisis, and now disease. The cows are not there this year, but the show must go on.
Thank you for listening to Le Weekend, your one-stop destination for the main headlines in France. Catch our weekly roundup every weekend wherever you get your podcasts. Stay informed.